Potential Not Pathology, embracing creative and resourceful approaches to psychotherapy with author and therapist Dr. Paul J. Leslie.
Welcome to Potential Not Pathology, where we offer information and inspiration for mental health therapists who are interested in learning and applying unique therapeutic techniques and concepts into their work. With a focus on the potential each client brings to his or her therapy session, this program examines ideas and tools which can assist your clients on their journey toward healing. I'm Paul J. Leslie. I'm glad you're here. Today we get to have a fun interview with Bette Freedson. Bette is a clinical social worker who is working in the state of Maine. And she has written this wonderful book called Soul Mother's Wisdom, 7 Insights for the Single Mother. Betty's a very accomplished therapist and an excellent writer, and her work has appeared in many different magazines, including Calgary's Child Magazine, Working Mother Magazine, Woman's Day, etc., and etc. And she's a very gifted speaker and an excellent therapist. She comes from a background of blending such therapies as cognitive behavioral therapy and Ericksonian psychotherapy and hypnosis. So today we're going to talk with Bette about a few really interesting topics. One is the role of intuition in therapy. A lot of therapists are reluctant sometimes to trust their gut, and as a result I think their work becomes inhibited. And so Bette kind of addresses how important it is to pay attention to intuition when doing therapeutic work. She also shares one of her models she uses for therapeutic interventions, acronym called SOLVE, S-O-L-V-E. We discuss more about her excellent book, Soul Mother's Wisdom. We discuss the importance of relationship, which sometimes gets overlooked with a lot of the emphasis on outcomes in therapy and measuring those. Also the necessity for circularity in therapy. And we do discuss a little bit about working with single parents as this world changes and dynamics and the structure of the family change. Single parents face a great deal of stress and particular issues that are unique. And Bette addresses the resources and things we can sometimes add to our therapeutic cocktail to help single parents as they move through the journey of life, trying to be both mom and dad to children. So I hope you enjoy this wonderful interview with Bette Freedson. Bette Freedson, welcome to Potential Not Pathology.
Thank you.
Well, I'm delighted to have you here today. I'd like for you to begin by letting everybody know what was your journey to becoming a therapist?
My journey, Paul, began when I was a little girl. And people would say, Bette, what do you want to do when you grow up? And the only answer I had was, I want to help people. I didn't know what that meant at the time, but I had an image of myself that ran throughout my childhood of my sitting in a room across from someone in a very peaceful setting talking. And so I think I came in with this as a calling.
You know, how old were you when you had that?
I really, from the time I can remember, first memories. And that played through my life in the sense that I loved to play school and always be the teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I was a young mother, thinking about what else I wanted to do besides bring up kids, I participated in a program at a local counseling center. At the time, it was called People to People. And I met a therapist who was working at that agency, and I also met a man who was a healer. And that began a dual path of my life, and healing using my skills as a therapist, using intuition as soul wisdom, and you know how passionate I am about the inner wisdom of the mind.
Right.
And that led me to social work school and really to the dual path of dual paths of my life work,
Mm-hmm.
and to this moment with you.
Oh,
Being able to talk about that is really wonderful, and I
oh,
appreciate the opportunity to do that.
oh, absolutely. I'm always envious of people who, from an early age, knew what they wanted to do. I think when I was really, really young, I think Batman was about as good as it got for me. So it's taken me a
Yeah,
lot longer to.
that's pretty good, Paul. That is some superpowers.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm just writing a blog about, being the superhero in your own life. So
Ah,
I think
okay.
Batman's pretty good.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Um, well, as someone who you mentioned intuition, and I would like, if you don't mind, we'll jump into this already. Using intuition, and I don't mean strictly in an esoteric fashion, but just using intuition when working with clients. If you have advice for therapists who may not trust themselves enough to begin using intuition more frequently, what would that advice be? And could you elaborate on kind of how you feel intuition can help in therapy?
Oh, that's a wonderful layered question, and I'm delighted to speak to that. First, let me say, for a clinical perspective, what I've been reading and studying about the new research into brain science and you know,
Mm-hmm.
bioneurology is that the brain is affected by how we think, and how we think affects the whole mind body spirit unity. And, we're not necessarily going to go into a lesson on brain science, but the neurology is the information about the neurology is out there. So if
Mm-hmm.
we think about intuition as another way of thinking, and I remember in social work school, Paul, my introduction to intuition as another way of thinking from a clinical perspective was in a statistics class.
Huh.
And in the statistics class, the professor, who was actually a very well known businessman, gave us the syllabus, which contained the first 6 books we were to read were all esoteric, metaphysical, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, the Tao of Physics, Carlos Castaneda books. And he said, lest you think the scientific method is the only way to achieve knowledge. And
Hmm.
that opened me to what I believed, that, okay, this is where science meets intuitive knowing. And it was so affirming. So for therapists, first, to affirm for ourselves that it's okay to know at a deep gut level, that counts. And then the path we each take to that is going to be unique to our own interests. Mine, and as you know this about me, and we share this, is the Ericksonian approach in therapy,
Yeah.
which utilizes the deep unconscious resources in the mind. Whatever we call that intuition, we call that, you know, uh, mind knowing, inner wisdom. It's the depth of our own inner beings that somatically, intuitively know certain things. And when we combine that with the knowledge that we have in the concrete world, very powerful. So I love to teach, I teach other clinicians various courses that always include what I call a soul wisdom approach, which includes what we know from our learning in the concrete world. We want to call it left brain, we can, but it also includes how we think and how we feel ourselves into right choices, right actions, solutions. And in my work, I always embody or include some way of having the client check in with themselves. How would you know in your body? Where do you know in your body what's correct in this situation. And that includes certainly a cognitive, somatic, and intuitive approach. I'm like you, all about potential as opposed to pathology.
Right.
So that's a capsule, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
happy to go into more detail in that if you would like me to.
Well, yeah, because you mentioned something that I've kind of been railing against as the left brain encroachment and domination of therapy the last few years, and I'm generalizing here, but I've noticed, with their, we have treatment outcomes and those kind of things which are important, but I see therapists now being trained as technicians rather than healers. And, a lot of the people who inspired me certainly had a great deal of technical ability, but there was this openness, more right brain creativity and intuition and those things that I think was really the magic formula. How do you, when you're doing supervision or you're working with other therapists, have you found it sometimes difficult to get people to just kind of let go of thinking they have the right way and the only way, and they have to follow set patterns when performing therapy?
I wish we had about 3 hours or more to discuss this because we're very much on the same wavelength. So part of the way I deal with the reality that in the insurance world and in the world of left brain critical thinking, which is good thinking, I don't oppose it. What I have a hard time with is when it is factored out as the only way.
Mm-hmm.
So I tend to look towards integration. And when I teach or I guide other clinicians, what I want to look for is how can we integrate the concrete knowledge and the requirement in the world now for evidence-based therapy with intuitive knowing, with the resources that come from the unconscious mind. And to do that, I've actually developed a few little algorithmic methods. I call them my schemas,
Uh-huh.
in which I incorporate many of the features of, let's say, CBT or REBT, and dealing with cognitive ways of growing. But I incorporate also the intuitive way of knowing. So one of those schemas I call SOLVE, SOLVE. And I wrote about that in my book, in the Soul Mother's Wisdom, in the in the chapter on stress management, because intuition is also a way to manage stress, which is another fascinating way to look at it. But in the SOLVE method, S stands for the situation that's come up that one is working on. And the O stands for opening. So we open to what we know, and we open to what we think and what we believe. Now, it requires a degree of awareness. And so, as a technical person, as a therapist, as an intuitive person, I would work with you, Paul, to have you open to all of what you sense and know and feel on every level. And I know you enough to know you do that, and probably do that with your clients and your supervisees in your own way. But the opening to intuition is a part of that. So the L in SOLVE is to let go of chatter in the brain, which people often say, but I still have these thoughts coming in, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Letting go doesn't mean totally free of all thoughts. It means allowing the flow, because somewhere in those thoughts can be one little piece of flotsam that has meaning on a deeper level. So we work with that to learn how to do that. And sounds, it sounds a little bit glib to say just SOLVE, but it takes practice. And then the V has to do with visioning. and really allowing images to come up in the mental screen, which is also very intuitive. And then also V has to do with verifying. So verifying means, we check what we've got intuitively with what we know critically and begin to integrate. And E is an evaluation, essentially, try out what your solution, what you're led to, and evaluate it. And so that's a little capsule on one of my schemas that I use to do the integrating of the intuition. And this, by the way, works really well with children. And it has worked very well in my work with kids who are on the PDD spectrum. Different pieces of that it can be very helpful for kids who have some issues, some processing issues. That's another conversation. But so integration, if I were to say to you, well, how do I deal with the primary focus right now in our overarching clinical world on the critical thinking, I'd say I incorporate it, I integrate it. It's useful. It's not necessarily all there is in my belief system. So hopefully that gives you, a little, focus on that question.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm as you were saying that, I was kind of thinking to myself, as your schema, it sounds also like it's open to flexibility and rearranging and things like occur in real time. Whereas, unfortunately, I find a lot of techniques, it's like you have to do them a certain way at a certain time, and everything is so spelled out.
Oh boy, we're of a mind together, and it's very flexible. And sometimes I will say to people, it's laid out in a linear way so that I could have an acronym. But basically, those steps, we could spend several sessions on one step. And really, I prefer and have talked about in Soul Mother's Wisdom a circular schema. I like the idea of a circular schema.
Yeah.
We can go back and forth among steps, and we can work on different parts of a certain step at a certain time in life, depending on what's called for. That what's called for in my life today might be to really let go, whereas when I was learning more about intuition, I was really opening. So I agree with you. We've got to have the flexibility. I think what a schema gives to me, and I found this useful with clients and other therapists, is a way to begin to organize the thinking around a process. And that process really does have situational applications and flexibility for me. I mean, I, like you, I have a hard time with anything that says you got to do this first, and then you have to do this, and then you have to do this, and you have to use this language. And one of the things I love about our Ericksonian work is that it allows us to be creative within our own systems.
Right.
There are certain concepts that are very helpful, but we're free to explore in ways that help us to really manifest our own creativity and our own effectiveness. So that again, it's the integration and the flexibility that I believe in, like you do.
Right. Well, you brought up circularity and being circular, and I'm curious your thoughts on circularity in therapy. From a systemic perspective, circularity is a pretty major part of working with individuals and families. This kind of in cybernetics, they call it the second order, in which the practitioner is a part of the process that he or she's working in. And I'm seeing now we're kind of still having this linear way of doing therapy. Do you find that having a linear, point A to point B and ignoring the circularity, that we're just as much a part of this changing process as the client or clients. Having too much linear gets in the way of having successful outcomes.
Again, just really very, very electric topic for
Mm-hmm.
me. So in my first career, I taught school, and it was interesting how the thinking would swing back and forth from inclusion classrooms to separating kids based on IQs and learning capacities, and it would swing back and it would swing again. And then I think the same thing happens in our field.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember as a new clinician learning from my teachers and my mentors the importance of the relationship and the importance of what goes on in the relationship. And I think of that as a critically important part of the therapy. And whether we think about it as, transference, countertransference, whatever terms are being used, or thinking, that from a systemic perspective, that I as a therapist am going to be part of whatever system of change there's going to be. I don't really understand how one can factor out a person in the room who's contributing and has a certain energy that's in there. So
Mm-hmm.
from a kind of human sensible point of view, the circularity makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
The other piece of circularity that makes great sense to me is the idea of how we grow. And in Soul Mother's Wisdom, 7 Insights for the Single Mother, Chapter 3 is about a model for developing self-wholeness. And it's geared towards single mothers, but it's a generic model that could apply to anyone. And the concept that I'm putting forth is that we grow in stages in a circle, and that the centripetal force of life, centripetal force moves people towards the center. The
Yeah.
centripetal force of life events push us and force us and guide us to a center of self. And that I envision as a circular process in which we spend time around a circle and spend time at different points in our development and our integration of a solid, essential core of self. And so the circularity in terms of a concept, the circularity in terms of a process happening in present time makes sense to me. I think that our field has become so focused on outcomes, which I'm not opposed to.
Sure.
And solve method and other schemas have embedded in them ways to track outcomes in the evaluation piece.
Yeah.
And that's okay. And we have to live within the culture we've got.
Yeah.
But to just factor that out and say, that's it now, that's it. And, your personality and your skills and your art and your being, your energy in the room doesn't have an effect, doesn't make any sense to me.
Right.
And from a spiritual, psycho-spiritual, holistic perspective, makes no sense to me.
Yeah.
But we have what we have
Mm-hmm.
currently, and I would prefer to work with it, even though I don't see it as partialized in the way it's now being partialized.
Yeah. I had an interesting conversation the other day with a marriage and family therapist, and I was asking her kind of, what they studied. And, when she was in school, she's fairly new out of school. And I was so surprised how this circularity that really helped create the field of systemic interaction. The bulk of what they were actually doing was cognitive behavioral. And again, it's no disparaging that, but it's kind of like, why'd you go into marriage and family therapy? Because it doesn't sound, as Salvador Minuchin wondered sometimes, where's the family and family therapy anymore? Because there's no circularity,
Yes, and holism.
Yes.
There's a holism there, and somehow, unfortunately, this is an interesting topic too to explore, is that this idea of holism kind of got tinged with this stigma around new agey,
Right.
and that really what matters is just, tangible steps toward a linear outcome. Not
Mm-hmm.
bad. I mean, that's great. I liked, especially with kids, and especially with kids on the spectrum, having something that's pretty linear and spelled out can be very effective. But there are uses for it, and I use cognitive stuff when it seems to be what's called for.
Mm-hmm.
It's the one and only that I find hard to adapt to. Um, but I'm adapting, and trying to utilize the parts that really make sense to me and have meaning for me within that. And like you say, I mean, it's changed, and there is far more focus now on the cognitive behavioral, and probably going to change back at some point to something else, but I would not predict what. Maybe you and I will have an impact in how it changes, Paul.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Mm-hmm. Because again, it fits into the theme of potential as opposed to pathology.
Mm-hmm.
A group of people get together and decide in mental health, what are the features of this label, and then we have the book and we decide it's this label, and we have to do that in order to get paid if we take insurance.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a fact of life, and it's a reality of life, and it helps to understand some things. Doesn't necessarily explain the causes and etiology of things, but it helps to give a description, and different theorists come up with the ideas of how come. But that's okay. I guess we need that too. But the intuitive, the person, the energy of the person, the resources of the mind, boy, do I see that every single day in my work, how that brings people to growth, to shifts in moods and states, and to epiphanies that help them to see the world in a whole different way.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you see that too.
Yeah, yeah, I absolutely do. I wanted to kind of diverge a little bit from what we're talking about, but yet also bring in your book, Soul Mother's Wisdom. This has been very well received, and there's a lot. Even though I think it's a book for any lady, there's also some great therapy in it. And I was wondering if you could tell me what brought you to write this wonderful book.
Thank you, Paul. Well, it really is a book for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
But even if one isn't even a parent, there are things in there that can be useful. However, my inspiration to write this book had to do with the fact that I was a single mother for 17 years.
Uh-huh.
I was divorced when my kids were very little, and a few years after the divorce, my ex-husband died, and I became a divorced single mother. I call it a single mother for real. He was no longer on the planet able to help or share, and it was quite a road. And along the way, I learned a tremendous amount about myself. I went into social work school in the middle of the divorce. When shortly after I graduated from social work school, I think maybe almost as soon as I graduated, it was in my first job, he died.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt always, as I said in the beginning, this calling to help others. And it seemed to me that if I could put together my experience as a single mother and the experiences of other single mothers with what I had been learning clinically, that this could be a powerful help for single mothers to have what I didn't have, which was, there was nothing. There were no books. There was no internet. There were no support groups. I think there was maybe I forget the name of it now. That's a single parent group. But there really was very, very little for support. So it took me 15 years to write the book, from inception to publication. And
Yeah.
in the process, I learned how to write. I learned that this was really more than just for single mothers, but I wanted it out there for single mothers.
Mm-hmm.
And it was also part of my healing, and to tell my story, to understand my story. And partly it took a long time because I knew I had to write it not from a place of anger, but from a place of my own healing. That it could not be vindictive to people who I felt had hurt me or misused me along the way. It had to be from a higher place in myself, a more healed place. And I don't mean higher like I'm better than someone who
Mm-hmm.
isn't healed enough, or I'm still healing every
Right.
day. But it had to be not from a place of um, vinegar. It had to be from a place of, this is what happened to me. Here's how it can help you. Here's what I've learned. I want to share it. And also, I had to consider my children, and that I wanted them to be old enough to be able to see it, read it, understand that it was really about my process. So it's out there, and I want the information out there, and I hope it helps single mothers and other parents, single dads. A lot in it is generic.
Right.
Thank you for asking about it.
Sure. What do you think as a therapist when you are working with single parents? What do you think are some of the most important resources that we can assist them with?
Oh boy, that's a great question. I circling back to the whole idea of the resources in the self.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things I'm working on right now, and Ray and I, my husband Ray and I, have just started writing a book together on some of these ideas. For single parents, it would be to have what I call a soul wisdom approach. And that includes having what I'm naming, putting it out there, publicly for really the first time,
Mm-hmm.
practical wisdom and uncommon sense.
Mm-hmm.
And that involves having a set of practical strategies to employ, including stress management strategies, of course, and strategies for accessing the inner wisdom of the mind. Because when we need to solve problems, we need both critical thinking and intuitive thinking, in my belief and in my experience.
Right.
So a set of practical strategies can have certain common denominators, and one of the most important common denominators is to come from a no blame, no shame approach with children. Another very important strategy that I teach to both parents and clinicians excuse me, is to help all parents, but particularly single parents, to have a support network and to be able to seek support as needed, whether it's social, whether it's from some professional or pastoral helper, to really know that I'm not in this totally alone.
Mm-hmm.
There are strategies around the importance for single parents, especially if there has been conflict, or if there hasn't been, to keep children out of the adult business. So children in situations where there's been separation or divorce particularly have a tendency to be used, and it's common sense because they go back and forth between households, used as messengers. Well, what happened at mom's house? Well, what's going on at dad's house?
Yeah.
And that can be very hard on the children, even though it makes common sense. And if the two parents aren't particularly favorable about speaking to one another, this could be a really easy way to be able to communicate. Well, you tell your mother that, or
Yeah.
you tell your father that. the uncommon sense, which of course is sensible, is that this ultimately is not really beneficial for the children. Some of that isn't going to warp them. But part of what single parents really need to have are adult supports where they can vent, and they need to find a way to do the business of parenting, their children, which doesn't include employing the children as their employees.
Right.
And that takes practice and that takes learning. So those are some strategies. And then the soul wisdom approach is always including finding ways to access the inner knowing. And I will teach them this solve schema. I have a 1, 2, 3 schema. I have an A, B, C, D, E, F, G schema, in which the G stands for gobble. Some very timely topics. It's almost Thanksgiving. And this comes from a great wise person I knew who used to call distorted thinking the gobbledygook. And we shortened it to the gobble. And when single parents have been traumatized themselves because divorce and separation or death is traumatic, or having a spouse deployed can be ongoing trauma, thinking sometimes gets muddled up. And
Right.
This is where cognitive behavioral can be very helpful to help clarify the distorted thinking.
Yeah.
But it's not the only piece. And again, that's where the integration comes in. So for single parents, for all parents, really for all people, combination of life strategies and ways to access your soul wisdom, your inner knowing, and then put them together. It's powerful, very powerful. So, there's a lot of information in there for single parents, single moms, as I said, for everybody. It's also part of the book details my own journey to finding my own intuitive resources, my own psychic gifts, which I have been somewhat careful to talk about, and have talked about somewhat euphemistically, because I'm not a fortune teller and I'm not a sidewalk psychic. But I have intuitive gifts that I've honed, and I do really enjoy using them to help other people. And you could call it just when you sit with a client and give them some feedback. You're using both what you know, and you're using intuition to sense what would be the best way to put this out there for this person. So I'm really, again, working so much on integrating the strategic, the clinical, the steps toward a solution with the intuitive process of understanding oneself and using that to make life better, to make more effective choices, to help our children. This for me opens up worlds to explore. And I suspect for you too. I think knowing you, and that you're so focused on potential, which is really what we're talking about, is the potential for how to use all of what we have in ourselves is powerful stuff. And and the new brain science for me, it's always been brain science. We just didn't know it as science. Just confirms and affirms this from every angle. And I remember at one of the evolution of psychotherapy conferences, I remember hearing Herb Benson give a talk about how they had done MRIs on the brains of people both before and after they meditated. And the MRIs showed different parts of the brain being stimulated and lighting up. Just so fascinating when we begin to prove some of the things we know about metaphysics and spirituality and intuition, and we start to know that scientifically soul wisdom make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Really powerful for me. And the potential there is just, I think, unlimited.
Yeah, I agree. And I think maybe the more seasoned the practitioner is, maybe kind of looping back to some of our earlier statements, trusting themselves a little more to access that feeling of knowing rather than a technique. If I have a sensation that I should ask someone, I remember one time, as a matter of fact, I don't even remember much about this client, but I remember something popped in my head about baking brownies. And just by bringing up, something just popped in my head about, baking brownies. That led to some discussion about the interaction she had baking brownies with her grandmother, which opened a frame for some really profound work. And, by not staying too linear and just, that feeling of knowing, I think if one can trust that, sometimes, if you'll excuse the term, magical things can happen in a session.
Well, I would not only excuse the term, Paul, I would use the term magical things. You and I both know Jeff Zeig, and we
Yeah.
know how, much he teaches, the Ericksonian and others, in that world. And one of the things I've learned from Jeff, which you just described in terms of talking about baking the cookies, is he talks about how it's important to follow the baby thoughts. And
Mm-hmm.
he doesn't claim being the originator of that particular idea. And I forget who he borrowed it from, but he talks about that in the classes I do with him. And you followed a baby thought. And those baby thoughts, that's such a lovely way to think about it, because it's like these little thoughts pop into our heads, and, we're sitting there and, thinking critically and thinking clinically and, using the skills we have, and then something will pop in. And if we follow it, magical things can happen, because who knows where it came from. And that also circles back to talking about, being a person, being someone in the interaction, so that you give the input to your client from your thought about the cookies, but that came from you, and that triggered something in the client. So how we eliminate the person from the paradigm, I don't get that. And maybe, someday you can tune into a robotic application and get therapy. Maybe that'll happen. Maybe it'll work for some people, but I personally cannot picture that.
Yeah.
Yes, I just pictured it, but I can't understand how that could possibly work. So you followed the thought, and intuitively it came to you. I love your expression, the feeling of knowing.
Mm-hmm.
I love that, because sometimes the feeling of knowing is really a somatic experience as opposed to a cognitive experience.
Right.
And I've been writing a guest blog since January for the website of the online magazine entitled Somatic Psychotherapy Today.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually really helpful for me for this blog I'm working on, because there is a feeling of knowing that comes in. And you don't even necessarily always know what you know. You knew cookies, but you didn't know until you said it that it was going to trigger that really lovely circle of thinking for your client.
Mm-hmm.
So, that I think is part of what we can do, is to be tuned in. Also, Paul, I think it takes practice to really trust that.
Yeah.
And takes, I don't know as a new therapist if I would have trusted that to the extent that I do now,
Mm-hmm.
or to the extent that I will in another year.
Right. Mm. Well, In the last minute or so that we have, I was wondering if you could let people know the best way to not only find out about your books, but also your practice, your workshops, and the best way people can get in touch with you.
Thank you. Well, people can check out my website, which is Bette Freedson, BetteFreedson.com, and can reach me in that way. I'm very happy for people to email me at bjfreedson@gmail.com. And my book is available through the publisher, which is Pearl Song Press, through Amazon, Barnes and Noble. It's available to be downloaded, and I'd be delighted for people to get it and read it, and then email me and tell me what it means to you and how you've been able to use it. And happy to, in any way I can help to share more with people about some of these topics, I would be more than glad to.
Okay, well, great. I have so enjoyed visiting with you today in our interview, and I think that maybe in the future you and I need to do another one, because I think there's so many things left unsaid just due to time constraints, because I think we probably could have talked for a couple of hours.
I agree, and I thank you so much for inviting me, and I'd just be delighted to do another interview and talk with you some more, because a lot of our ideas are very much in sync, and I'd love to share more about all of our work, and so anytime.
Great, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Potential Not Pathology with Dr. Paul J. Leslie. If you enjoyed the show, check out our website at potentialnotpathology.com, where you will find programs and articles showcasing unique and creative therapeutic applications.